What's the most morally disgusting thing you've ever seen someone do? Not as bad as some of the other stuff here, but a friend of a family member called an ambulance for their friend who was actively dying of cancer to get her out of her house, just so her and her daughter could raid the place of all the valuables. This included her cancer pain meds, which they sold. Worked in animal rescue, welfare, and encountered so many people who just had zero regard for other beings. Lots of mutilation, such as people using their kitchen scissors on their cat's ears and paw pads, giving their dogs body piercings and tattoos, literally just cutting chunks out of their pets for no reason other than to see how far they could go. Hoarding cases are awful, but it's truly a mental illness, and hoarders believe that they are helping. Backyard breeders are unethical and create sick frankendogs. But the mutilation really sticks in my brain because there's no explanation for it that could even pretend to pass as logical or humane. A friend had told me that his great-grandma was dying of breast cancer, and it was collectively decided by the entire family to let her daughter, his aunt, be in charge of her assets, retirement money, savings, etc., to take care of her needs, only for the daughter to start stealing money slowly and not providing her basic needs. The family only found out what was going on when his great-grandma begged his older cousins for some money for food and toiletries. When his aunt found out, she started abusing his great-grandma and made it worse. All hell broke loose within the family, apparently. I work in animal rescue. I hate people most days. The abuse to animals is sickening. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, "It's just a dog or bird or horse." I have a cockatoo that spent 3 years in a cage, in a closet, under a blanket because she was too loud. I have a dog who was terrified of boots because a man kicked her constantly. I rescued a cat who was tortured by neighborhood kids. They had duct-taped firecrackers to her tail, then closed her up in a box and tossed her in the middle of the street to watch the box explode. People are cruel. Had a friend who was manipulated by someone who entered our friend group. He had received an inheritance when his father passed away and was told to use it for his education. He ended up moving in with the manipulator, and in no time at all, the guy convinced him that he could triple that inheritance by selling drugs. He said he would make his money back by the time his tuition was due. The thing is, the guy persuaded him to spend the entire inheritance, leaving him with no money for rent, no money for anything. He took the drugs, ran off to Maryland, and changed his phone number. We tried telling him this was a bad idea, but in our friend's eyes, this guy was the coolest, or something. Yes, I know this can be chalked up to stupidity. But our buddy had lost his mom at a young age. His father passed away before he turned 19. His stepmom tried to keep everything, kept most of it, changed the locks to the house his father had built. He was going through a lot of crap at that time and was easily manipulated. One time when I was just a kid, maybe 10 at oldest, I was walking to a friend's house. A dark-haired teenage girl, probably 16 or 17, was walking about 20 paces ahead of me. Along the way, she met up with a blonde teenage girl. They appeared to be friends as they walked along, talking to each other. Suddenly, a car pulled up, and the blonde girl shoved the other girl to the ground and kicked her right in the face. Then she got in the car, and they sped off. The dark-haired girl just lay on the ground, crying. I froze in place, not knowing what to do. After a few minutes, a guy on a motor scooter showed up and helped the girl up, and she got on the back of his scooter, and they left. I've probably seen worse things in my life because of what I do for a living, but I'm now 47, and this has stuck with me my whole life. My uncle is the worst person I know. He physically abused his wife, a really sweet, lovely woman, for a decade, and one day he left her outside bloody on the street without her hijab and chador. They live in a very small, super conservative religious city in the Middle East. A lot of people saw it, and that was the final straw for her family, who hadn't let her get a divorce over the years, even though they knew about the abuse. He went to jail for a bit only because the family asked for her sizable dowry, not because of the abuse. Of course, my grandparents bailed him out by paying the dowry. A few years later, he threw my grandfather down the stairs in a fit of rage. To this day, this grown-ass man doesn't work and mooches off my grandparents. The rest of the family pretends nothing happened, and I'm the only person that doesn't speak to him. As a kid, I took a job selling windows and siding, and an old lady called the ad about windows and siding because she wanted storm windows on her home. The salesman and I went out, and she was about 90 years old but wanted storm windows. He sold her new windows, which meant rather than placing storm panes over her current windows, they would be ripping out the old and installing double insulated new. He financed this monstrosity of a project and got her to sign on the dotted line. I left that job the minute I got back to the office. Morally disgusting. I was at a cheap food store. A young couple with a baby were buying groceries and stuff to get by on. When they went to pay for their things, they didn't have enough to cover everything. She started to cry because she couldn't pay for her tampons and pads. Turns out they had moved to our town for a job, and he was 3 weeks away from his first paycheck, and they were living in their car. A well-known high society lady behind me in line was scolding the young couple about if they couldn't afford it, they shouldn't have put it in their cart. She was loud and nasty about it. This is the same woman who was a pillar of our community and a standout for the Mormon Church. I don't usually puff up often, but I told her to shut her mouth, then paid for all their stuff and even gave them my address so they could shower or warm up or whatever. They were very adamant about staying in their car. I have seen other stuff, but this one really bothered me and does to this day. At one company I worked at, the owner preferentially hired desperate halfway house residents and single mothers to telemarket his get-rich-quick program. He got in trouble repeatedly for withholding paychecks from the less successful ones, sometimes for sexual favors, sometimes just because of money. The local cops figured him out after a few too many complaints, but hey, no real consequences as long as he handed over the disputed paycheck, so it didn't stop him from trying. My own role was too crucial for payroll shenanigans. I knew the product was garbage, but it took me way too long to realize just how much of a sexual predator the owner was. I said it the other day, one of the most scummy legal things to do is to be one of those shitty, grin-set, entrepreneur, YouTube gurus, who fake all their shit like renting their crazy sports cars to take photos with before returning them, posing in front of houses they don't own, pretending they made $50K on the stock market in one day, etc., and then turn around and try to sell their secrets online in some bullshit class or book. They're living off of teenagers and young adults funneling money into their system and the views they get on YouTube, and likely a lot of mommy and daddy's money. It's the scummiest, yet legal, way to scam someone. One of my best friends growing up had parents who were dealers. Their house was the trap house, where everyone in the neighborhood got their weed, narcotics, and at one point meth. It was a revolving door and there were constantly people there from noon till throughout the evening into the early hours many times. The house was absolutely infested with roaches. Eventually their friends' customers brought bed bugs too. The walls were covered in soot and yellow gunk from every visitor and the parents smoking at all hours. Every piece of furniture filled with third-hand smoke. They couldn't have a microwave, the roaches were so bad. One of their kids had to sleep in the living room since no space in the bedrooms. It didn't matter if they had school the next day and visitors were there, the kid was expected to sleep through it. The kids very obviously had CPTSD from the living conditions. Despite this, the parents chose to keep buying bulk product, to keep making minuscule money and supply their friends' selves instead of saving the money to get a good exterminator or help their kids move out at 18. I didn't even live there, just visited multiple times a week to hang with the kids, and the amount of just pure neglect and disregard for their kids' well-being was traumatizing. When I was 15, one of the dogs at my mom's place started acting strangely. Cowering in corners, not eating, generally appearing sick and to some extent dying. My mother started to examine the dog, and she found a pustule on his butt. Instead of taking our sweet dog to the vet, she decided that she had the experience to make our dog better. Every night for 2 weeks, she would constrict the dog, heat up a needle, and poke a hole in the pustule. She'd squeeze out the yuck that was inside while the dog whined and cried. 2 weeks, every night in a completely non-sterile environment. Finally, my stepdad said enough, and they took him to the vet. Turned out his anal glands were inflamed and had been for years, also why the dog kept chasing his tail. We all thought he was just doing a dog thing. They had to remove the anal glands, but also told us it wouldn't have been necessary had my mother not intervened. I still think about the suffering my mother put him through. My mother never appeared morally compromised, not before and not after. In her head, she had just tried to help, while making it worse and torturing the poor dog. But I also remember her saying that vets are expensive, and I think that had a large part in it as well. Moral of the story: don't have pets if you can't afford to take them to the vet. And don't ever think you can fix it yourself. You'll end up putting your pets through so much suffering. Unfortunately, I was the one who did the morally disgusting thing. I work for a rideshare company and had a passenger I was picking up from the hospital. The passenger is brought out in a wheelchair and needs a nurse to help him in. He doesn't speak any English, and I know very little Spanish, so communication is difficult. The hospital was paying for the trip, and I was taking him to a homeless shelter. When I get there, the place is locked up, and there's a number to call for service. I call, and they tell me that the hospital didn't call us ahead of time, so we won't take him. I call the hospital, and they say, "Oh yeah, the shelter always says that. Just drop him off in front of the shelter and they'll eventually bring him in." To this day, I'm ashamed that I had to help this feeble, old man, with little to no understanding of what's going on, out of my car and just sat him on a bench next to the shelter. Government employee. We found a homeless person's tent and belongings set up and tucked into a little space between two walls behind our building. The person was obviously trying to survive in an out-of-the-way spot without intruding on anyone's private property. The tent was not obstructing any gates, doors, entrances or exits, roads, or anything else. It was just tucked up against the building on a grassy part of the property that was literally never used for anything. I was literally in the process of printing out a note on our letterhead to leave in the tent and ask the occupant to clean up and head out, along with printing off some resources for unhoused and vulnerable populations in our area. Our building maintenance guy trashed it. He completely broke the poles so they couldn't fish it out of the dumpster and set it back up, and threw everything away, then tossed more trash on top of it. When I asked why he would do that, he said that people like that shouldn't be around normal people and this is how you get rid of them. Any friendship we had built through working together was gone for me in that moment. I stopped chatting with him and transferred locations soon after, unrelated, but haven't spoken to him since, though I've been back to visit other coworkers since then. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on the best Reddit stories.